Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and while you're at it, click the bell to be notified of future videos. This block is called 4 squares, and it finishes at 12 inches. It took me a little bit to realize, why is it called 4 squares? Well, there's a square here, that's 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's 4 squares. Here's the diagram, and it's mostly square in a square or square on point to piece these first 3 rows or these first 3 squares. And then the last square is, I call it a frame, and when we piece this frame, we're going to learn how to cut these parallelograms, and also we're going to learn how to do mitered corners. So don't run away. It's going to be easy. So hang around and you'll see how we do this. Here are 4 blocks set block to block. Now the single block is nothing to look at really, but when you put these together, you have this nice 8-point star right in the center. Here are the patches. The first patch, A and A reversed, I call the frame. We're going to cut 8 assorted 2.5 inches by 7.5 inches. And we're going to stack these in pairs, then cut off the triangle on one side. The other part of the parallelogram will be cut off when we do the mitered corners. Patch B is a 4-inch finished quarter square triangle. We cut a square 5 1/4 inches, cut it in half on the diagonal twice to get 4 patches. We'll need 4 patches of the background and 4 patches of the accent fabric for the first square on point. Here are the AccuQuilt dies for the rest of these patches. Patch C is a 4-inch finished half square triangle. Cut 4 7/8 inch squares, cut it in half once on the diagonal, and you'll get 2 patches. We need 4 patches total, and that is these outer triangles for the third square. And patch D is a 4-inch finished square. We cut it 4.5 inches. It's 1 patch you need, and this is the center square. Here are the fabrics I'm using for this sample. I took these. This is patch A and A reversed. I have some leftover jelly roll strips because they're 2.5 inches, and I cut those. I have 8 of these, and they're all assorted. This is patch B. It's the quarter square triangle. This is patch C and the half square triangle, and this is patch D, the square that goes in the center. For step 1 and 2, we're going to take patch D, which is the square, and patch B, and stitch this square in a square or a square on point unit. Then we'll do the exact same thing in step 2 with the C patches we're going to add to that unit we did in step 1. Take patch D and patch B's. I like to sew opposite sides on first. So we'll stitch these 2 together, press the seams, and then we'll stitch these 2 pieces on like this. And this is called square in a square or square on point. If you're not familiar with this, just stay tuned for a short tutorial that tells you how to do this. Once this is finished, we'll do the same thing with the C patches. And these will go like this. So this will be our center unit once we're finished with it. We start with opposite sides. I like to flip the triangle over with the right side up and then place the other piece on top of it, and I'm lining up this edge. Then I'm looking at these little triangles that are sticking out to make sure that they are the same size, and I'll stitch 1/4 inch. Do the same thing to the other side, this opposite side here. Then press your seams open, and we'll do the remaining sides next. Trim these nubs off even with this edge. And do the same thing over here. Next we'll attach the other 2 sides, and do this the same way. Put the triangle down right side up, and then center this on the edge. line up the edge and center these little triangles. Do that for both sides and press the seams open. Here's our first square in a square, and we'll trim these nubs on all the sides. Next we'll take our C patches, which are these, and we have to watch the placement of these. You'll see the C patches are two different fabrics. Here's the dark fabric, so we need to place a light fabric right across from it, and the same thing here. Do this the same way. Flip this over, center it. You see your little two little triangles, and then stitch across there. And do the bottom part too. Press your seams open, and then repeat that with the dark fabrics. Here are the two sides. In order to make these points nice and sharp, you'll want to stitch with this piece of fabric on top so you can see where the point is. And so let's cut off these nubs. Put this down, flip this over, and center it again. And what you'll want to do is, when you're stitching your 1/4 of an inch, you'll want to stitch right above this point. You don't want the point to be cut off, so stitch above the point and keep going. Here's a close-up of the stitching. I missed the point, so it comes out really nice on this side. The center units are done, so the first 3 squares are done. We're going to turn this over and mark the corners for our seam allowances. I'm going to use the Marty Michelle Deluxe Corner Trimmer because it has little holes that show you where your markings go. So I'll take the 90-degree mark, lay it down on the fabric. Let me turn it this way so I can see. You lay it on the fabric and you line up this edge with the edge of the fabric and this edge with the edge of the fabric. Take your pencil, and there's a hole right there, and you just put a little mark like that. And do that for all of these 4 corners. Line it up, put the mark. And I'll do the rest later. We can put this aside for now and take our patches for the frame. And I should have told you before you started, if you can starch these pieces really well, it'll be much easier to piece and much easier when you're doing the miter. I'm going to show you several different ways to piece these, depending on what kind of tools you have. We'll start with 2 of these and put them wrong sides together. We're going to cut a triangle off of one side, and we'll do both at the same time. So make sure these are pretty even. The first method is if you don't have any special tools. You just have a ruler with a 1/4 inch marking on it. And this is the edge we want to cut off. You can cut off the other edge if you want. If you're left-handed and that's easier for you, just do them all the same way. We'll place this 45-degree mark at the bottom of this piece of fabric. And we want to line up. The 45-degree mark is along the bottom edge of the fabric, and the corner is right at the corner of the fabric. Cut this 45 degrees. So there's what we cut off. When we open these, we have them going in different directions. This is one side of the frame and they're all the same. Then we're going to stitch a B unit right between the 2. So we're still working with only this ruler. We'll take our B unit and it goes in right here. But in order to do that, flip this over, and these 2 sides here, we're going to mark the seam allowance. This ruler has a 1/4 inch mark here. I'm going to line that mark up at the bottom edge of this fabric. And if you look at it, it's right along the edge of the fabric. So you can't see any fabric peeking out from underneath it. Basically, this line is just underneath the fabric. The reason I'm doing that is when I use my pencil to mark, the pencil has a thickness. And if I place this line right on the edge of this fabric and use my pencil to mark, you'll get more than 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. So this way, I'm making a smaller seam allowance as I'm marking to allow for the thickness of the pencil. Turn it this way and do the same thing on this side. There you have that. When you sew this, we're going to flip it over. And you see where the mark comes out. We want the very tip of this to be at the very tip of the fabric here. So I'm going to move this up a little bit and then line up this edge. So we want this edge lined up and we want this tip to be at the very bottom of this fabric. And then over here, you can glue this if you want. This edge up here has to line up with the top of this fabric, right where this angle is. Now I'll stitch it and show you what it looks like stitched. Here it is stitched. So we started right here at the bottom edge and we stitched 1/4 of an inch. And you'll see here that I came off of the drawn line. That's because I still had 1/4 of an inch here and I wanted the end of my stitching to end right here at this angle, because that makes this, when you open it up, that makes this flat across. This is why this method is the least accurate, because it's easy to get off on your measurement. There's nothing wrong with that, but you can see how you need to fix it as you're stitching. You need the stitching to come out there. If I had the stitching coming out here where I had it marked, it would look something like this after I open it up. And we want it to look like this. Okay, so you have to be a judge as you are sewing. Does it make sense and will it come out how you like? So now this, we will press our seams open. Here are the seams pressed open and I cut off the 2 nubs at the top and bottom. Now we're going to piece these 2 together. Flip this over so we can see our markings. And this I want to line up at the top and along this edge. It's so much easier to do if you have it picked up, but that's okay. We'll get it done. So I'm lining up this edge and I want the mark at the edge here to line up at the edge of the fabric. So you see there's my 90-degree mark and I have this marking ending right there in that angle, in that corner. And I want to make sure that this is lined up against this edge and we're going to stitch. If you look down here, this is where you want your stitching to come out, right where that 90-degree angle is. Here's our stitching. I see I started right in the corner of that angle, stitch 1/4 of an inch, and when I got down here, I was aiming for that angle right there. So let's open this up, and we need to press it still, but there is nice and straight across there and straight across here, and we'll press this open. The seams are pressed open, and now we'll cut off these nubs. And this one is ready. I'll sew all of them, so I want to show you each different method. So that's method number 1 if you only have a ruler like this. Let's take 2 more, put them wrong sides together, match them again. This time we're going to use the same method to cut the square, but we're going to use a different method to place the sewing to find the seam allowance. So we're line up the 45-degree mark and line up the edge or the corner of the fabric and cut off your triangle. Now for this one, we're going to use Deluxe Corner Trimmer. We're going to trim off the angles. So this is a 45-degree angle, and if you're not sure, whatever angle fits. If it doesn't line up right, it's not the correct angle. So we line up this side, and we're going to cut off 2 little parts here. So there's two parts that are cut off. And they do the same thing on this side. And you'll also take your B patch that's going between the two. We're going to trim this angle. And actually you can trim all three angles if you want. Same way. So this is a 90-degree angle. So you look for the 90-degree angle on this tool. Edge off. That's one piece you cut off. That's one piece you cut off. And take your 45-degree angle and cut off these points here. This just gives you a much easier way to line up the points, and it's a lot more accurate than drawing lines on your fabric. Okay. Now these will go here and here. Now if we flip this over, we just match all of the pieces we cut, all of the angles that are cut, and matches perfectly, and you stitch 1/4 of an inch. Press the seams open and do the same thing on this other side. Here is it stitched, and this meets right here at the edge. This has a little bitty cutout here, but the line is straight across, so that will be taken up in the seam allowance. Now you flip this over on this side, match these cut off little slots or little clippers. So you're matching up here and right here and along this side. Sew it 1/4 of an inch and press your seams open. Here is it stitched, and this meets right here at the edge. This has a little bitty cutout here, but the line is straight across, so that will be taken up in the seam allowance. Now you flip this over on this side, match these cut off little slots or little clippers. So you're matching up here and right here and along this side. Sew it 1/4 of an inch and press your seams open. And here we have method number 2. So use whatever method you want to finish all 4 of these frames. And next I'm going to show you how to miter the corners. Remember, we marked the 4 corners. I added some extra starch to the frames and to the squares part here. It just makes it easier when you're doing your mitered corners. So here are the corners that are marked, and this will go on like this. Let me move this one out of the way. And flip this over, and then I want this part on the bottom. We'll have to match these 2 points because we want these points to be pretty. This point here should match this point here. And we do that with a pin. Right at this point, we place our pin right at the top of that point. And then we go to the bottom part, place our pin right at the top of that point. Match these edges up here and turn this to the side. You want this pin to be perpendicular straight into the fabric, and then put the pin into the fabric like that. We're going to go to this side over here, and we're going to start stitching right at this point here that we marked in the corner. What I do is I start with my needle down in that point. I take 2 or 3 stitches this way, then I back up 2 or 3 stitches. I'm putting a back stitch in there just to hold it because it's going to be loose a little and we're going to be working with it on the miter. So starting at the marked point, take a few stitches front, a few stitches back, and then go ahead and stitch through this way. When you get to where the pin goes into the fabric, you want to take that pin out a little bit and stitch right where the pin went into the fabric. Continue your 1/4 of an inch. Make sure these are lined up well. And you're stop right here at this point and take a few back stitches. So let me go sew that and I'll show you. Here's my stitching. You see I started at this point and I took some back stitches. This is how the seam allowance is now open this way. Then I stitched 1/4 of an inch all the way down, and I'm aiming for this point. And you can see when I got to this point, this is no longer 1/4 of an inch. But it's more important for me to have that point be pretty. So I just sort of aimed for that point up there. And then I aimed to get back on my 1/4 of an inch. And I got to this side. And when I got here, my machine was telling me that this is 1/4 of an inch, but my marking wanted me to go further. So I decided that I'd rather have this good 1/4 of an inch than try to aim for this part. And if you don't get right next to that marking or right on it, it's okay to have a little bit of extra. You're going to have 3 pieces of fabric meeting in this area, so it won't matter if you're right on it or not. And then when you open this up, you have your points. I'm going to press these seams open, and I'm going to add more starch. Here it is pressed open. And when I pressed the seam open, I continued pressing this piece up like this. And then on this side, I pressed the seam allowance up like this. So you see, you have a really nice point. Both of them, the points are pretty. Now we're going to do the second side. Here's the frame I want to stitch here. So I'm going to turn this over so I'll know how to place it, and then flip this over because I need this part to look at this marking here. Match your pins so you'll have pretty points, and this will be the same way you just did the first one. Line these up, start here with your needle down, take a few stitches, back stitch, and then go. Stitch right before the point of the pin going into the fabric. Then straighten this out on this side. And when you get here, fold this up out of the way and stitch right up to that point. Be careful that you don't take any of this in with you. So if you don't exactly meet that point, that's okay too, and take your back stitches. Here we are, my stitches with my back stitch, 1/4 of an inch, bind the point, keep going, and then when you get to this end, you stop right here and take your back stitches. Now we'll press this seam open as well, and remember to press this edge up. And when you get here, move this out of the way and press this edge up. And then you have all of this sort of flopping around, but just make sure it's out of the way next time you sew. When you finish pressing this, do the next 2 sides the exact same way. All right, here's what it looks like after you've sewn all of the sides on. They're all loose, but they lay like this. Everything lays flat. And let's turn it over and look at the corners. Okay, here's one corner. If I were to press these up like this, you see how this lays flat? That's a good thing. So all of them should do that. Right now they're just kind of folded over. Now we're going to turn it on the diagonal, and we're going to grab these 2 points here. Pick it up, and we're folding it along the diagonal. So I'm going to concentrate on this side first. This will be my first miter. So you see how these lay flat? And I'm matching these seams here, sort of stacking them on top of each other. And you can feel it with your finger. And these seams here, you're sort of stacking on top. And all this is laid stacking on top of each other. So I would try to match this line here. It's a little bit off, so I'm going to try to match it without moving it. All right. We want everything to be nice and matched all the way across here, even though we're just concentrating on this part. And make sure this is all flat because you want it to be squared up. You can come in here and cut that, trim that corner. You see, I just trimmed it right here. So now it can lay flat. But we're going to leave it open like that. I just wanted it to lay flat. Now when you're happy with your fold, if everything is all lined up on both sides, this side and this side, take a ruler, lay it along this fold here, just along the fold. And here's your last chance to get everything straight here. Take a pencil and mark a line, just straight, even with that against your ruler, and mark it like this. So you see my ruler is going straight down here, and then wherever it landed here, that's where I'm marking. Now let's put a pin there, or 2 pins. Now we'll take this to the sewing machine, start up here, right here, do a back stitch, sew on the line, and come off. Here's my stitching, right on the line. I did a back stitch up here and went off. Now before we trim this, let's check to make sure we're happy with our miter. So open this up, and we see that it's going to lay flat. So I'm happy with that miter. Then we'll go over here, trim this down to about 1/4 inch. It doesn't have to be exact. And then we'll probably want to press that seam open. Now do the same to all 3 of the others. And here's the finished block. If you want to ever miter your borders, you do them the same way. You cut the 4 pieces. You just have to make sure that you cut them long enough to cover it. So this was only 2.5 inches, so we didn't need that much extra length, but just make sure you have enough. So here's the block. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel, and while you're at it, click the bell to be notified of future videos.